Okay. Good evening and welcome to the first of our series, Be More Human, sponsored by the In the Loop Ministry Group of the Presbytery of Baltimore. My name is Annette Snyder. I am co-convener of In the Loop with Karen Brown, and we're really excited about having you all join us tonight to begin our conversation. Just to tell you a little bit about why we're trying to do this, why do we need to have this conversation? So our group, as all the ministry groups are doing, was striving to find a way to contribute to the important conversations that are going on in our society at this point in time. The Dismantling Racism forum that the Presbytery held last week was right aligned with what our thinking was as well. So our vision now includes dismantling racism, but also to disable our institutional biases, to disavow hateful rhetoric, and to and that is, and be disrespectful to, injustice. So what we hope is that this forum will be an ongoing means for us to speak truth to others and to ourselves, our personal truths, to seek understanding, to listen to each other and learn and be more aware and more enlightened about what the issues are, to the extent that we do and don't understand them. This is not a conversation for any one group of people. It's not just for white people or Black people or brown people. Each one of us needs to explore the secret thinking that we do, that is buried in our psyches, in our core of our being, even in our Christianity and our faith. We need to listen, we need to think, and we need to act. So we hope that sharing the information that we will be sharing tonight and during our other conversations will help us all do that. And with that, I'm going to turn the mic over to our interviewer of our panel this evening, Alex Spiderly.
Yes, good evening, everybody. As Ms. Annette Snyder said, my name is Alex Spiderly. I'll be doing the interview, and I'm going to give you a quick summary of Ms. Nikole's first article for the 1619 Project, a project that's really dealing with the history of African Americans and the ways that we've affected the system in America. So the first article, I don't have the exact title written down, but the first article is about the racial effect on politics. It starts basically with the idea that Blackness, the idea of being Black, really hit home as soon as the first 20 slaves started to come to America. There's a point on that slave ship that something rings in their head that goes, I'm not going back to Africa. Everything from here on out is going to be different. Those first 20 slaves get to mainland America, Port Comfort. That's a little bit funny to me, but Port Comfort, and they get traded. And at this time, the idea is they'll be indentured servants. You can work some of this off. But within the next 150 years, slavery becomes an institution. There's no more they can work this off. It's set up for generations of a specific group of people to be slaves. That is something that makes slavery in America, in the Americas, different from historical slavery throughout the world. There was a point where the idea became, we're going to take these people that we have labeled as Black and decided, hey, they're going to be slaves. So in that 150 years, we get to 1776. And most of us know, or all of us should know, the way they teach it in school, that's the year that the American Revolution starts. And we get a story about Thomas Jefferson and his drafting of the Declaration of Independence. And in his drafting, he does acknowledge that slavery is bad. He has a half brother that is mixed and is pretty much his slave. And he's like, oh, this isn't the best thing. But through revision and showing the other people, they're kind of like, we won't get everybody on our side if we say they can't own slaves or they shouldn't own slaves. So all of that gets left out, and we get the declaration we know it as, with all men are created equal, while simultaneously owning slaves. This becomes a big deal in terms of the Revolutionary War, because the loyalists, the people that are loyal to Britain in America, pretty much say, y'all are fighting for freedom and y'all are going as far to call the British monarchy slave owners. Y'all are calling yourselves slaves as colonists, but you own people. This, like, y'all don't get that that's wrong. But the idea ends up being, look, we'll just kind of gloss over it now, get to it later. But there's never really a plan to get to it later. So, long time for slavery. We get to the Civil War, and Lincoln is like, man, the South got a little bit too much power. The only way to really cripple them and keep this country together is if I fight to free the slaves. Has nothing to do with a moral obligation to slavery, like to saying slavery is wrong or anything like that. As a matter of fact, Lincoln meets with 5 Black abolitionists, and he pretty much tells them the real problem is the way we treat y'all, and the fact that, and the second problem is the fact that us whites have to be around you. It's more your fault than it is ours. And we really, the plan is to free y'all and get y'all out of this country. We want to get y'all somewhere else. And the abolitionists go, no, I'm an American. I don't know anything else but America. My ancestors are from here, as far as I know. So in fighting that, that's like one of the first steps after the Revolutionary War, where Black people are going, no, we have just as much of a right to this land and to all the things that Jefferson and them proposed as you do. Lincoln ends up freeing the slaves, but makes it painstakingly obvious, no, I do not think Black people will ever be equal. So slavery gets abolished with the 13th Amendment. Then with the 14th Amendment, the idea that the law is supposed to treat everyone equal sounds really good on paper, but we know that it's not always the case. That comes to pass. And then the 15th Amendment is the right to vote. All of this is basically because Black people that were once slaves are like, okay, we're free. Not only are we free, but we want the same rights. What's being left out is the fact that really it's just men getting these rights. So when this right to vote comes, it's like, yeah, Black men get the right to vote. Black women don't get to vote. White women don't get to vote. And it helps spur on the suffragist movement with the idea that, hey, if Black men are getting the vote, we should get the vote as women, well, as white women specifically. So this leads into Reconstruction. For like the first 10 years of Reconstruction, there's still a military force set in the South. So things aren't terrible. Like, people are kind of getting with the times, growing with the times. But then Ruther B. Hayes is running for president as a Republican, which was the Progressive Party of the era. All the stuff that we look at as social issues then is stuff that we would assume the Republican Party would have been for. Or the stuff that we consider conservative now. I'm just jumbling that up. Basically, the Republican Party wasn't the Republican Party we know it as now. It was the party of Lincoln, the party that fought to free the slaves, even though morally there was a gray area. So to win the election, he pretty much, even though he's running as Republican, he tells the Democrats, hey, I'll just end Reconstruction, and that'll be it. So he ends up winning the re-election, and the South just goes as close to slavery as they can. In some ways, it's referred to as the second slavery. And then we get Jim Crow laws. Now, during this time of Jim Crow, there's the Plessy v. Ferguson decision, the separate but equal. As long as everything is equal, it's okay to separate on certain basis. And eventually it gets to the point where Black people want to be in the military. That's always been a way in America that you can prove your patriotic duty and prove you love this country, is by being in the military. But white people aren't really too keen on the idea of allowing Black people to fight in the military, because they feel like they'll go around the world and see they don't all get treated like that. Or they'll go around the world and come back and have a different level of confidence. And in some ways that does happen. They go around the world and they're like, whoa, this isn't the norm. I don't have to put up with what I'm putting up with at home. Some didn't even come back to America because of that. They got over to places like France and was like, okay, I'm happy here. What ends up happening, a Black soldier returns home from war and he gets into it. His name is Issa Woodard. He gets into it with a white bus driver, and it ends up with him getting beaten till he's blind by police officers. And, you know, this was kind of the norm in the South, but the NAACP ends up getting involved, and it ends up being like the first seed to the civil rights movement. This is before Emmett Till. This is before the bus boycotts. This is a completely different time period. And that seed that led to the civil rights movement ended up encompassing every group of oppressed people. Most often, we're taught that the civil rights movement was really like the Jim Crow law like movement, like we're just against segregation, and that's not what the case was. Because of the fact that Black people had been being oppressed for so long, it led to a different looking at everybody being oppressed. It went, women are oppressed, Black people are oppressed, women are oppressed. People are oppressed based on their sexuality. People have always been oppressed based on their money. And because of the consistent fight of African Americans in this country, we have had a strong stake in most of these movements. This leads to the discussion about privilege. When you look at the history and you want to really understand privilege, I look at it like, when we look at the history of America, we can tell this was made by white men in power and for white men in power. The systems that this country is based off says that white men are supposed to be the ones with the power. Men specifically. White straight men, even more specifically. And then there's like a ladder. There's white women and Black men that are like scraping at each other because a white man might not respect the ideals of a white woman, but he will protect her against a Black man. And this is not to say this is everybody, but this is just how the system that has been put in place works. Now, as a man, I understand that in certain ways, if I go into a corporate room and they're looking for a leader and it's me and a white woman as a straight Black man, I might be able to get that white woman out of there. I might be able to get that job over her, because as a man, they're going to look at my leadership qualities and the way I present myself as that's something that we can get behind. Even if he is Black, he a man's a leader, go with him. And this whole discussion is just really about us understanding all about privilege and how the system in this history in this country has aided in these specific privileges. That's pretty much the summary of what we're going to be talking about. The first question for our panel: how has privilege manifested in your personal, spiritual, and professional and religious life? Do we have anybody specifically that would like to go first?
Yeah, I'd be glad to go first. I think Dr. Brown asked if I would lead off. Is that right, Karen?
Yes.
Great. Good evening, everybody. It's good to see some familiar faces and some new folks as well. So I think specifically white privilege that I'll address as a white man often prompts some level of defensiveness in people. And so I think it's helpful for me to define what I think it's not. And certainly I'm open to correction in this, but I don't think that white privilege means that white people have never struggled. And I don't think that it's the assumption that everything that a white person has accomplished is unearned. Rather, white privilege is having a greater access to power and resources than people of color in the same situation. And I think as a white man, that's certainly been my experience on the whole, operating in the racism of our country, and then more specifically, the racism of our church, and even more specifically, the racism of Baltimore City. There are a lot of different ways I think that I experience privilege and white privilege, and there are a lot of different ways of talking about it. I think one is the fact that often whiteness is defined as, quote, what's normal. And I think about this in relationship to the church. It wasn't too long ago that any congregation that wasn't predominantly white was referred to a, quote, racial ethnic congregation, as if there was no race or ethnicity connected to people of Euro descent and white people. So that what is normal is defined from what is white. And I think there are lots of different examples of that in the world. People have talked about the fact that so-called flesh-colored Band-Aids were defined that way according to what was a similar color to the skin of light-skinned people, for example. It's another example of the power of what is defined as normal and normative. So that, you know, white people then are able to move through the world with the expectation that the world will be organized in order to meet our particular needs. And when it's not, we have a right to respond appropriately. Whereas when people of color react when the world is not meeting their needs, somehow there's something that is wrong with them or needs to be stopped. I was thinking about this sort of a lighthearted story when I was in Montreat one time teaching with a friend of mine who's a person of color. And I just walked into the crosswalk and he said, I would never do that because a car might hit me. And we kind of laughed together. I said, yeah, if I step into the crosswalk and someone hits me, it's their fault. But if you step into the crosswalk and someone hits you, then it's likely going to be your fault. And I think that's another way to think about white privilege, is that white people in general are often given the benefit of the doubt. So no one's ever followed me around in a store to suspect whether I would steal something. Whereas most of my friends and colleagues of color have shared with me stories of being followed around in stores as if they are suspects. If I'm a jerk to someone else, then people think, oh, that guy's a jerk. Whereas often if a person of color is a jerk, then something is attached to that, to their race. It's racialized in a way that doesn't happen for someone like me. I think one of the most recent examples, if you followed the news, is the tweet that the white male motorist put out after his encounter with the boys who were washing windows on the corner, where apparently he got out of his car when a young man came up to wash his windows and threatened the young man. The young man defended himself. And then later this white person tweeted that Black Lives Matter activists had attacked him and his daughter. And for the first day was given the complete benefit of the doubt, as if that had actually happened when in fact it had not. And then the last thing I'll say, because I think I'm probably up on 3 minutes, is the threat of violence is never something that is always at my back. And it's something that's not equal. So for example, if I walk through a predominantly white neighborhood, I feel safe and I probably am safe. I live now in a predominantly Black neighborhood, and I'm still actually safer than the people of color in aggregate that live in my neighborhood. Why is that? Well, because we know from statistics that encounters with police, I am most often going to be given the benefit of the doubt. And I think that's a great example of to be white in America, I can go into particular spaces and not have to worry about the threat of violence that could be raised at any moment for a person of color. Lastly, I think I should say, in terms of professional work, the church, I serve a church that's predominantly white, historically white, and it's better resourced. And where does those resources come from? Those resources come from the accumulated wealth that we know from statistics, again, is partly the result of that package of white privileges that have been built into the system over a period of generations that now insulates my community, for example, economically in a way that makes us more privileged than, we'll say, your average community of color, church of color, that may not have the same accumulated wealth because of those generational kinds of privileges that have been afforded to the congregation that I serve.
Thank you. Thank you. Next is gonna be Reverend Keith Page. Can you unmute yourself, please, sir?
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. My question is, does the question refer to me as a privileged person or me experiencing white privilege?
Both.
Oh, okay. Well, part of me being a privileged person is much more because of my gender than because of my race. Being an African-American male pastor in an African-American church, traditionally, African-American males have a privileged status traditionally. And it's so interesting because even though the lion's share of the work in the African-American church, and this is across denominational lines, is done by women, there is something about being African-American and male that puts me in a privileged position. Now, with regard to race, the white privilege, I have to be conscious of white privilege almost all the time. For example, I am a cyclist, and there are some places where I choose not to ride my bicycle. Why? Because there are certain neighborhoods that are Trump country. There are certain neighborhoods like out in Marriottsville where you have gun ranges, and I don't fancy the idea of being a lone Black man riding down a street with white men who have and use automatic weapons. So when I was I was telling somebody else this, when I was in seminary, I would walk across the campus and colleagues, people, professors, colleagues would greet me by saying, "Good morning, Andre. Good morning, John. Good morning, Raynard. Good morning, Floyd." And I'm going, huh? I think I'm in the twilight zone.